Wisconsin looks like the kind of place nothing bad happens. Small towns with grain elevators and frozen lakes. County highways that run straight as a ruler through cornfields and dairy farms. A water park resort where kids shriek over wave pools on a Tuesday afternoon. A half-mile farm driveway where a family has lived for 3 generations. Where everybody knows everybody's name. Where a little girl has walked home from school 100 times without incident. Safe. Ordinary. Home. 10 people stepped into places exactly like that and never came back out. A car left running with the keys still inside. A styrofoam cup balanced on a cold hood. A record still spinning on a turntable in an empty house. A 6-year-old boy last seen checking out of a water park with his mother, and then gone. 10 Wisconsin places. 10 files that are still open. Lock the door. Pull up the map, let's get into it. If you're new here, subscribe, we cover cases like these every week. Case 1 takes us back to the spring of 1947, and I want you to hear how this one starts. Because when you do, you're going to think there's no possible way this goes wrong. It's a Thursday afternoon. It's a farm. It's a little girl walking down her own driveway toward her own house. And then you're going to understand exactly how wrong you are. May 1st, 1947. The town of Oakland, Jefferson County, Wisconsin. It had been raining that morning, not hard. Just enough of a steady drizzle to make the dirt lane leading up to the Weckler farm soft and muddy. Just enough that 8-year-old Georgia Jean Weckler didn't ride her bicycle to the Oakland Center School the way she usually did. Instead, she climbed into her mother's car with her siblings and got a ride. Her father, George Weckler, was a man of standing in the community. He served as the town treasurer, and the family had worked that land off Highway 12 long enough that their name was woven into the fabric of Jefferson County. Georgia Jean was a 3rd grader, quiet and artistic. She liked flowers and drawing. She was a member of the local 4-H chapter. On that particular Thursday, she had plans to pick wildflowers for a May basket from the woods that bordered the edge of the family's property. One of those small, ordinary pleasures that belong to spring in a small Wisconsin town. Here's how routine this afternoon was supposed to be. A neighbor named Carolyn Florke gave Georgia Jean a ride home from school. Mrs. Florke's own daughter attended the same school, 2 years behind Georgia Jean. And this kind of informal arrangement, a neighbor ferrying kids on rainy days, was as unremarkable as the mud on the lane itself. Mrs. Florke drove out to the property, pulled up at the edge of Highway 12, and stopped at the end of the long half-mile lane that led back to the Weckler farmhouse. She watched Georgia Jean step out of the car. She watched the little girl walk to the mailbox at the road's edge and collect the mail, a small armful of envelopes. And then she watched Georgia Jean turn and start walking down that lane, in the direction of home. That is the last time anyone who knew Georgia Jean Weckler ever saw her. Mrs. Weckler wasn't alarmed right away. The children often came home in pieces, staggered arrivals, different routes, different reasons for delay. She assumed Georgia Jean had stopped to pick flowers in the woodline, or maybe dawdled along the lane watching the rain clear. Maybe George had spotted her on his way back from town and brought her with him. So Eleanor Weckler waited. She kept dinner warming on the stove. She told herself that the sound of the door would come any minute. And then George Weckler came home at 6 o'clock in the evening alone and looked at his wife's face, and they both knew. They called neighbors. They called the Jefferson County Sheriff's Office, and within hours, before the sun had been down long, more than 200 volunteers were moving through the 20-acre wooded patch adjacent to the Weckler property. They searched in darkness, in cooling mud, calling her name until their voices went ragged. They found nothing, not a shoe, not a ribbon from her hair, not a thread of the clothing she'd been wearing when she walked away from that mailbox. Here's the critical detail that transformed this from a missing child case into something investigators still cannot explain, 8 decades later. A truck driver came forward in the days after Georgia Jean disappeared. He told authorities he had been driving on Highway 12 that Thursday afternoon, right around the time she was dropped off. He clearly remembered a dark car parked on the shoulder of the road, very close to the mouth of the Weckler driveway, and just as he was about to pass it, that car pulled out suddenly in front of him. He had to swerve hard to avoid a collision. When he looked back over his shoulder, he said he saw a young girl skipping along the road. That was the last confirmed sighting of Georgia Jean Weckler. Sit with the geography for a moment. A half-mile lane. Flat, open farmland in every direction. The middle of the afternoon in early May, still light. A little girl with a handful of mail, walking toward a house she had walked toward hundreds of times in her short life. Between the mailbox at the end of that driveway and the front door of the farmhouse, Georgia Jean Weckler ceased to exist. No sound, no struggle that anyone reported, no trace. Just a lane that ended at a house and a child who never arrived. The search that followed became one of the largest in Wisconsin's history to that point. Men from across the county brought their tractors and cleared the Weckler fields so the family could pour every waking hour into looking for their daughter rather than keeping the farm from falling apart. Women brought food and covered dishes. Neighbors repaired fences and sheared the family's sheep without being asked. The community wrapped around that farmhouse like it was trying to hold it together by force, because if this could happen here, on a half-mile lane in the middle of the afternoon, then nowhere was safe. Now this is where the investigation turns, and where the dread deepens in a different direction. Authorities eventually zeroed in on a man named Buford Sennett. He was 22 years old in 1947. He was already known to law enforcement as a violent, sexually based offender, a pattern that fit the profile of a crime like this, investigators believed. By late 1947, he was in custody in northern Wisconsin, facing charges for the murder of a University of Wisconsin-Madison student and the rape of the victim's sister-in-law. And in December of that year, while behind bars, Sennett sat down with a Jefferson County district attorney and confessed. He claimed he and one, or possibly two other men, had targeted Georgia Jean because her father was known in the community to have money. He said the plan was to hold her for ransom. He said they gave her sleeping pills to keep her quiet during the drive. He said she died from an overdose of those pills. And he said he'd disposed of her body in the Blue River near Richland Center, some distance from Jefferson County. Divers went into that river. They found nothing. Investigators asked Sennett twice to physically lead them to the location where he claimed to have left her. Both times, no remains were recovered. And critically, Sennett never signed the confession. He recanted it later. He was paroled at some point after serving time for the murder and rape. And in the 1980s, he was convicted again, this time for the sexual assault of two young girls. Jefferson County detectives questioned him again about Georgia Jean during that period. He told them he'd made the whole thing up. Buford Sennett died in 2008 at 82 years old. Whatever the truth was, if he held any part of it, it went with him. But here's what doesn't make sense, and what has haunted this case for 3/4 of a century. If Sennett made up the confession, why include details specific enough for investigators to search a particular river in a particular county? And if he was telling the truth, why did every physical search come up empty? A decade after Georgia Jean disappeared, in November 1957, a farmer named Ed Gein was arrested in Plainfield, Wisconsin, roughly 100 miles north of Jefferson County, for a series of crimes that shocked the entire country. Wisconsin State Police descended on Plainfield and attempted to clear every unsolved case in the region. They questioned Gein directly about Georgia Jean Weckler during a lie detector examination. He denied any involvement. He passed the test. Investigators found no physical evidence connecting him to her disappearance, and they officially ruled him out. The cases are not connected, as far as the record shows. But Georgia Jean's name got attached to his anyway, the way small-town fear works, looking for patterns in the dark. The file stayed open. Detective after detective inherited it. Excavations continued as recently as 2017, when a tip led investigators to a site in Janesville based on the recovered memory of a man who, as a child in the summer of 1947, believed he had watched two men burying something in a field. The dig turned up nothing. Jefferson County still carries Georgia Jean Weckler as a missing person. It is the second oldest open missing persons case in the state of Wisconsin. Eleanor Weckler, Georgia Jean's mother, lived until 1996. She reached the age of 93. People who knew her said that for as long as she remained on that farm, she left a light burning in the window at night, in case Georgia Jean found her way home. The farmhouse is different now. Eleanor has been gone for nearly 30 years, but the file, the second oldest in the state, is still open, and Georgia Jean Weckler would be in her mid-80s today. Between Highway 12 and the front door of a farmhouse in Jefferson County, Wisconsin. On a drizzling Thursday afternoon, in the spring of 1947, a little girl with a handful of mail simply walked off the map. 6 years later, another girl vanishes from Wisconsin, this time from inside a locked house in the middle of a residential neighborhood in a city full of people. On the night of a homecoming game, when 2,000 of those people were close enough to hear her if she had the chance to scream. The evidence they found inside that house would set off the largest missing persons search in Wisconsin history, and it raised a question that still has no answer. How do you disappear from a room that was locked from the outside? October 24th, 1953. La Crosse, Wisconsin. The city sits on the eastern bank of the Mississippi River, pressed up against the limestone bluffs, a college town, a river town, a place where professors lived in modest houses on quiet streets, and teenagers walked to babysitting jobs without a second thought about it. On this particular Saturday night, La Crosse State College was hosting its homecoming game. Half the city was there, or close enough. The streets near the stadium were loud with its car horns, distant cheering, the ordinary noise of a small American city celebrating something it looked forward to all year. And on a residential block in the south part of the city, in the 2400 block of Hochler Drive, a house sat quiet in the middle of all that noise. Lights on, radio playing, a 20-month-old baby asleep upstairs, a 15-year-old girl sitting downstairs with her school books, planning to study while the neighborhood was out. Her name was Evelyn Grace Hartley. She was a sophomore at Central High School. Her father, Richard Hartley, was a biology professor at La Crosse State College, the same institution whose homecoming game had pulled most of the South Side away from their houses that evening. Evelyn was the kind of teenager who made herself easy to trust, dependable in the way that teenagers rarely announce but that parents notice and come to rely on. She wore glasses, thick-framed ones, and she'd brought 4 or 5 school books with her that night because she genuinely intended to get work done while the baby slept. The Rasmussen family, whose daughter she was watching, had a regular babysitter, but that girl also wanted to attend the homecoming festivities. So they called Evelyn last minute, and she said yes. Professor Viggo Rasmussen and his wife left for the game. The baby went down for the night, and Evelyn Hartley settled in. She had a standing arrangement with her own parents. She would call home at 8:30 to check in. It was the kind of simple system that belonged to that era, a scheduled call, a thread you kept hold of to know your daughter was all right when she was somewhere else. 8:30 came and went. The phone at the Hartley house did not ring. Richard Hartley tried to call the Rasmussen house. No answer. He waited a few minutes and tried again. Still nothing. He wasn't panicking, not yet, but by around 9:20, he got in his car and drove the short distance to Hochler Drive. Here's what he found when he got there. The front door was locked. The lights were on inside, clearly visible through the windows. He could hear the radio playing. He knocked and called Evelyn's name. No one came to the door. He walked around the perimeter of the house, trying to find a way to understand what he was seeing. A lit house, a radio going, a daughter who wasn't answering, and that's when he found a basement window standing open. He climbed through it. He went upstairs and checked the baby's room first. The child was in her crib, sleeping, untouched, completely unharmed. And then he found the floor. One of Evelyn's shoes, a few feet away, the other, and her eyeglasses broken. Evelyn Hartley was not in that house. Richard Hartley ran across the street to a neighbor named Frank Linder and had him call the police. Officers Ken Johnson and Don Schoenfeld arrived within minutes. And what they found when they processed that house and the surrounding property is what turned this from a worried father situation into the largest missing persons search in the history of the state of Wisconsin. Pry marks on 3 of the home's exterior windows, evidence that someone had been trying various entry points before finding one that worked. Bloody handprints on the garage wall, roughly 100 feet from the house, blood staining the exterior wall of a neighboring property. A chunk of mud on the living room floor that bore the impression of an unusual tread pattern, the kind that comes from a specific type of athletic shoe. Investigators eventually matched that tread to a pair of size 11 Goodrich sneakers, discovered near Highway 14, southeast of La Crosse, several miles from the house. The shoes were blood-stained. The blood type matched Evelyn's. Inside one of the shoes, investigators found a single human hair. The Goodrich Company confirmed that the particular model, called the Hood Mogul, had been sold only in a 5-state Midwest region, which at least narrowed the geography of where the shoes had come from. A few days after the shoes were found, additional items surfaced along the same Highway 14 corridor. Clothing items including blood-stained undergarments that could have belonged to Evelyn, and a blood-stained jacket. A pair of men's pants was also recovered nearby. The blood type on the jacket matched Evelyn's. The men's pants were an unknown quantity. Investigators could not confirm whether they were connected to the crime. Here's the critical detail that reoriented the entire investigation. Multiple neighbors came forward after the fact and said they had heard screams that evening from somewhere in the direction of the Rasmussen house. One witness reported seeing a young woman in the company of 2 men. A teacher at Evelyn's school told investigators that she had noticed an unfamiliar car idling near the school in the days before the homecoming game, a car that seemed to have no business being there. This wasn't random, investigators began to believe. Someone had been watching. Someone had known the house would be staffed by a young girl, alone, on a night when the neighborhood emptied out. The pry marks on 3 separate windows suggested that whoever it was had tried to find a quiet way in before locating the basement window. This is where it stops being a disappearance and becomes something harder to hold in your head. Because in a residential neighborhood, on a night when people were coming and going from a game nearby, in a house with a radio playing and lights on, someone took a 15-year-old girl out of that house and left no credible witness. Nobody saw a car pulling away. Nobody saw a struggle in the yard. The evidence inside said something violent had happened. The evidence outside pointed in a direction, Highway 14, southeast, the corridor toward Shelby and Coon Valley, but then it stopped. Whatever happened after those shoes hit the shoulder of that highway, the record goes silent. The search that followed was unprecedented in La Crosse. More than 2,000 volunteers joined law enforcement within days, combing fields, riverbanks, drainage ditches, creek beds, and stands of timber across the county. Boy Scout troops were deployed to search the surrounding hillsides. The Civil Air Patrol flew aerial sweeps over the bluffs and the river valley below. The U.S. Air Force was brought in to assist the aerial component. Police undertook a systematic inspection program aimed at checking every single vehicle in La Crosse County for signs of blood, a county-wide sweep that was almost without precedent for the era. Gas station attendants across the entire region were asked to report any vehicle with suspicious staining that pulled in for fuel. Investigators even reopened recent graves in local cemeteries on the chance that Evelyn's remains had been concealed alongside a legitimate burial. The effort was enormous, coordinated, and costly in time and resources. It produced nothing that could be acted on. In May of 1954, more than 6 months after Evelyn vanished, authorities launched a mass lie detector program targeting high school students and faculty across La Crosse. The stated goal was to test over 1,700 people. The program became controversial, was challenged publicly, and was halted after roughly 300 people had been tested. None of those tests produced a usable lead. By the time investigators formally began winding down the active phase of the search, they had spoken to approximately 3,500 people. No one had been charged. No credible identification of a suspect had emerged that could be acted on. Now this is where the case takes the turn that became impossible to avoid, even if it went nowhere. In November of 1957, 4 years after Evelyn disappeared, a farmer named Ed Gein was arrested in Plainfield, Wisconsin, roughly 100 miles east of La Crosse, for crimes that stopped the country cold. Gein had been born in La Crosse. He was known to travel back to visit relatives in the area. The timeline of his documented behavior overlapped with the era of Evelyn's disappearance. Investigators asked him directly about Evelyn Hartley. He denied any connection. He was given 2 separate lie detector tests on the subject and passed both. A thorough search of his Plainfield property found no physical evidence linking him to Evelyn. Law enforcement officially cleared him of any involvement. His name has remained tied to the case in popular accounts for decades because the alternative, an unknown offender who was never caught, is somehow harder to accept than a known monster who didn't do it. Over the decades that followed, multiple people came forward and confessed to Evelyn's disappearance and presumed death. Every confession was investigated. Every one was ultimately rejected as false or impossible to substantiate. A recording surfaced in later years that generated renewed interest. It did not advance the case. The La Crosse Public Library maintains a news archive dedicated to Evelyn Hartley's case articles dating from October 1953 through the late 1990s, hundreds of them. A paper trail of a city refusing to let go. A book was written about it. 3 filmmakers, inspired by that book, began work on a documentary. The case has never been closed. Evelyn Hartley would be in her mid-80s today. The house on Hochler Drive still stands. The Rasmussen family moved away not long after. The baby Evelyn was watching that night grew up, was told as an adult what had happened in her home, and gave a brief interview about it years later. She remembered nothing. She was 20 months old and sleeping in her crib, while whatever happened to Evelyn Hartley happened somewhere in the rooms below her. The radio played to an empty house that night until someone thought to turn it off. The broken glasses stayed on the floor until the officers bagged them. The shoes went southeast on Highway 14 until they didn't. And then the trail ended and stayed ended, and the case that made La Crosse start locking its doors is still open today. The next one walks out of a party in a light blue prom dress and simply steps off the map into a dark field in Jefferson County. And what makes it worse is that the same piece of ground, the same rural banquet hall, would take someone else 6 years after Kathy Sjoberg, and that second case would eventually be solved, which only made the silence around the first one more difficult to sit with. June 5th, 1974, Concord, Wisconsin. Jefferson County. Again the same county where Georgia Jean Weckler vanished from a driveway on a rainy afternoon 27 years earlier. This time the setting couldn't be more different. This time it's the middle of the night, and there's a party going on, and there are dozens of teenagers within shouting distance. And Kathy Sjoberg walks out a door and disappears into the dark so completely that 50 years of investigation hasn't produced a single confirmed answer. The Concord House was a banquet hall and dance venue situated at an interchange off Interstate 94 in the rural town of Concord, roughly equidistant between Madison and Milwaukee. It was the kind of roadside hall that got booked for weddings and receptions and school dances, surrounded on all sides by flat, open fields and the particular darkness of farm country at night, with a highway running close enough that headlights swept through the parking lot whenever traffic passed the interchange. On the night of June 4th into the early morning hours of June 5th, the Concord House was packed with teenagers in formal wear. Oconomowoc High School was holding its post-prom party, and the lot was full of cars. The music was going, and the night felt like it was supposed to feel loud and young and full of the specific energy of a school year ending. Catherine Sjoberg, everyone who knew her called her Kathy, was 17 years old. She was a junior at Oconomowoc High, and by any measure, her immediate future was crowded with things to look forward to. The following day, she was supposed to hand out programs at the school's graduation ceremony. The weekend after that, she was supposed to be the maid of honor at a family wedding. She had her summer ahead of her, and all the things that come with being 17 in June in Wisconsin, warm evenings, people she loved, plans she'd made. She'd gone to prom with her boyfriend. She was wearing a light blue formal gown with white flowers and a brown and pink trim, a corsage on her wrist, high-heeled shoes on her feet. She had pierced ears and green eyes and freckles and long brown hair, parted down the middle the way everyone wore it in 1974. Here's the critical detail, the thing that would become the pivot point for every investigator who inherited this case over the next 5 decades. Around 3 o'clock in the morning, Kathy and her boyfriend had an argument inside the Concord House. The specific nature of the argument is not in the public record in any meaningful detail. It was late-night prom party friction, the kind of thing that ordinarily resolves itself by morning. What we know is that Kathy, after the argument, decided to step outside. She wanted air. She wanted to cool down. A girlfriend saw her as she was heading for the door and watched her walk out into the dark parking lot. That is the last confirmed time anyone who knew Catherine Sjoberg saw her alive. Her mother, Ruth Schwartz, had no reason to worry through that night and into the next day. Kathy had arrangements to sleep over at a friend's house after prom, a completely standard thing, and so her absence from home on Friday morning was unremarkable. It wasn't until Friday evening, approaching 24 hours after Kathy had walked out that door, that her boyfriend called the house looking for her. Ruth told him Kathy wasn't home yet. He called again, then again. By Friday night, he called to tell Ruth that no one could find her, not the friends she'd said she'd sleep at, not anyone from the party, not anyone who had any sense of where she'd gone after 3 in the morning. Ruth Schwartz called the authorities. But by then, something crucial was already lost. It had been raining the night Kathy disappeared, a damp, cold early June night, and the Concord House parking lot and the surrounding grounds had been trampled and rained on for the better part of 2 days before investigators began working the scene in any formal way. Any trace evidence that might have been left outside, footprints in soft ground, tire impressions at the edge of the lot, anything that might tell investigators which direction Kathy went or whether she got into a vehicle, had been washed away or compromised beyond recovery. The search began from essentially nothing: a parking lot, an open field, an interstate interchange, and a door a girl had walked out of 40-some hours earlier. The investigation moved first to the people closest to her. The boyfriend was questioned at length. He took a polygraph examination and passed. He was ruled out as a suspect. Friends and classmates who had been at the party that night were interviewed repeatedly. Not one of them could place Kathy anywhere after that doorway, not in the parking lot, not in a car, not walking across the field, not speaking to anyone she might have known, or to a stranger. There were no reports of a scream or a disturbance from the parking lot. There was nothing to indicate that anyone outside had noticed anything at all. She walked through a door at 3 in the morning, and that was the entire record. Now this is where the geography of the place becomes its own kind of argument. The Concord house sat almost literally at a highway interchange. Interstate 94, one of the most heavily trafficked corridors in the upper Midwest, ran close enough that anyone pulling off the exit ramp could be in that parking lot within seconds. At 3 in the morning, in a dark field between exits, with the main party noise still coming from inside the building, a teenage girl standing alone outside in a formal dress would have been completely visible from the road to anyone who happened to be passing through on a night drive. The fields on the other side of the lot offered zero cover in daylight, but at 3 in the morning they were nothing but black. Investigators considered seriously the possibility that Kathy had been taken by someone opportunistic, a driver on the highway who saw her, took the exit ramp, and acted in the few minutes she was alone. They could not confirm this, but the geometry of the place, a lit building, a dark lot, an interstate on-ramp within view, made it something they couldn't responsibly dismiss. Years passed. Tips came in and were worked through, one after another. The Jefferson County Sheriff's Office kept the file active and assigned detectives to it across multiple generations of investigators. A report surfaced at some point suggesting that Kathy was alive in California, that she had gone there voluntarily, that her disappearance was by choice, that she was fine somewhere and simply didn't want to be found. That tip was investigated seriously. It went nowhere. Ruth Schwartz never wavered in what she believed. Her daughter had not run away. The evidence of her own daughter's life made that impossible. Kathy had graduation programs to hand out the very next day. She had a family wedding to stand up in that same weekend. By every account from people who knew her, she was a happy teenager with no reason to vanish. She would not have left the people she loved without a word, not for a day, not for a week, not for 50 years. Then came 2009, and the brief, brutal moment when the Sjoberg family thought it might finally be over. Authorities in Louisville, Kentucky, announced the arrest of a man named Edward Wayne Edwards in connection with a cold case double murder from 1980. Timothy Hack and Kelly Drew, both 19 years old, had disappeared from the parking lot of the Concord house in August of 1980 while attending a wedding reception there. Their remains were found months later. The case had gone unsolved for nearly 30 years. DNA evidence finally led investigators to Edwards, who at the time of the murders had been living in the area and working as a handyman at the Concord house itself. The same building, the same parking lot, the same dark fields at the same interchange. The phone calls started coming into the Sjoberg family almost immediately. Could this be the connection? Could the man who killed Timothy Hack and Kelly Drew be the same person who took Kathy 6 years before them? Investigators looked hard at that question, and the answer that came back was no. Edward Wayne Edwards could not be placed in Wisconsin, in June of 1974. His documented whereabouts at that time put him elsewhere. Authorities stated clearly that they did not believe he had any involvement in Catherine Sjoberg's disappearance. The venue was the same. The circumstances were disturbingly similar, but the evidence, as investigators assessed it, pointed to different perpetrators. The Hack and Drew case was solved. The Sjoberg case was not, and the solved case sitting right next to the unsolved one made the silence around Kathy somehow louder. Ruth Schwartz told reporters at the time that the only good that could have come from the Edwards connection, even a false one, was the possibility that it might shake something loose that someone, somewhere, sitting on information, might feel enough pressure to come forward. It didn't happen. In 1995, 21 years after her daughter stepped out that door, Ruth Schwartz held a memorial service at a Lutheran church in Oconomowoc. She held it because there was nothing else she could do. No remains to bury, no confirmed answer to point toward, no inquest, no verdict, no resolution of any kind. She held it because 21 years felt like long enough that she needed to mark something formally to say out loud that time had passed, that a life had been interrupted, that the absence was real and permanent and deserved acknowledgement even without answers. She told those gathered that she believed Kathy had been abducted. She told them she believed her daughter was gone. She said the only thing she still wanted was to know where Kathy Sjoberg would be in her late 60s today. Her mother spent the rest of her life without an answer. Jefferson County still carries Catherine Lynn Sjoberg as a missing person. The Concord house still stands at that interchange. A corsage, a blue dress, a door, and on the other side of that door, 50 years of nothing. If you've been watching for a while, hit subscribe. Cases like these deserve more people paying attention. The next one is different in almost every way from what we've covered so far. Not a young woman, not a child. A 67-year-old man on a bicycle in a small lakeside city. He vanishes in 1983. A man is convicted of his murder without a body ever being found. And then, 38 years after the bicycle ride, two hikers stumble onto what the world had somehow missed, sitting in a popular state park that thousands of people had walked right past. August 1983. Neenah, Wisconsin. A small city on the western shore of Lake Winnebago, the kind of place where people ride bicycles through the residential grid on summer evenings without anyone giving it a second thought. Starkie Swenson was 67 years old. He had lived in Neenah long enough that his name meant something in the neighborhood. He was the kind of man whose absence would be noticed not because he was famous or powerful, but because he had a routine, and the routine was known, and when the routine stopped, people paid attention. In the summer of 1983, Starkie Swenson was at the center of what has been described in court records and local accounts as a love triangle. He had developed a romantic relationship with a woman named Claire Andrews, who was the ex-wife of a man named John C. Andrews of Chilton, Wisconsin. John Andrews, by accounts that would later surface in legal proceedings, had not accepted the end of that marriage or the existence of Starkie Swenson in his former wife's life. Investigators would later conclude that this was the engine driving what happened next. In the summer of 1983, Starkie Swenson was last seen riding a bicycle near Shattuck Middle School in Neenah. He went out on that bicycle, and he did not come home. His disappearance was reported to the Neenah Police Department. A search was conducted through the surrounding area, and Starkie Swenson was not found, not by the initial search, not in the weeks that followed, not in the months, not in the years. Here's the critical detail that makes this case different from nearly every other one we've covered. In the years that followed, investigators built a case, a real criminal case, with a named defendant and a formal charge without ever finding a body. Wisconsin law allows for a murder prosecution in certain circumstances, even in the absence of remains, when the evidence of a crime is otherwise compelling. By 1994, 11 years after Starkie vanished, John C. Andrews of Chilton was formally charged in connection with his death. The Neenah Police Department had continued working the investigation through those years, and the picture that had formed pointed to Andrews' motive established, opportunity confirmed, circumstances consistent with a man who had run out of patience with the situation and decided to end it permanently. But before the case went to a full trial, Andrews halted the proceedings by accepting a guilty plea to a reduced charge, homicide, by negligent use of a motor vehicle. The theory held by investigators that Andrews had used his vehicle as a weapon, running Starkie Swenson down on that bicycle near Shattuck Middle School, was embedded in the negotiated charge. Andrews was convicted. He was sentenced to 24 months in the county jail. He served his time, and he walked out. Starkie Swenson was still missing. This is where it stops being a conventional missing persons case and becomes something else entirely. A man had been convicted of killing Starkie Swenson. The legal system had run its process and produced an outcome. And yet the most fundamental fact where Starkie Swenson actually was remained completely unknown. No remains had ever been found. No burial site had been identified. No one had been able to tell the family where to go to bring him home, because for 38 years, nobody knew. Think about what that means for the people who loved him. A conviction exists. A sentence was served. The killer, as far as the law was concerned, had been held to account for something. But the family of Starkie Swenson couldn't bury him, couldn't stand over a grave, couldn't point to a place on a map and say, "Here is where it ended." The law closed a chapter that the family couldn't close, because the chapter has a missing page that no one could find. The case never left the attention of people who cared about it. Over the years, investigators and researchers continued to ask where Starkie might be. The question had specific urgency to it because of the nature of the landscape around Neenah Lake, Winnebago, state park land, dense stands of Wisconsin woodland, and because of the particular way Andrews had disposed of what he'd done, efficiently enough that decades of searching hadn't found a trace. Then came a professor named Jordan Karsten at the University of Wisconsin-Oshkosh. Karsten is a forensic anthropologist who has dedicated significant professional energy to exactly this kind of problem, using systematic fieldwork and physical science to find what conventional searches missed. He took on the Swenson case and began working it the way a trained researcher approaches an unsolved problem, methodically, with his students alongside him, with specialized equipment, and with the willingness to search ground that had already been covered because prior searches might have been looking in the wrong place or using the wrong methods. He narrowed the geography through historical records, interviewed people who had knowledge of Andrews' behavior and habits in 1983, and identified areas of interest that warranted physical examination. He produced a podcast about the case Cold Case, Frozen Tundra, that laid out the history, the geography, and the decades of dead ends, and brought the story to a new generation of people who hadn't known Starkie Swenson's name. University of Wisconsin-Oshkosh students participated in field searches, digging in locations that Karsten's research suggested might be relevant. None of those digs, while the podcast was running and the searches were active, turned up what everyone was looking for. And then, in the fall of 2021, the answer arrived in the most unexpected way possible. On the evening of September 28, 2021, two hikers using the trails at High Cliff State Park in Calumet County, a park on the limestone bluffs above Lake Winnebago, about 20 miles from where Starkie had last been seen, stumbled onto something in a somewhat secluded section of the trail system. They reported it to park officials. The Calumet County Sheriff's Office responded, and when Jordan Karsten arrived to assess what had been found, he knew almost immediately. Personal effects lay with the remains: a set of keys, with a distinctive keychain that people who knew Starkie recognized, a wedding band that matched descriptions, clothing consistent with the accounts of what he'd been wearing, a previously healed broken ankle that matched Starkie Swenson's medical history. The skeletal elements were consistent with his sex, age, and size. DNA testing confirmed it. The remains found at High Cliff State Park on September 29th, 2021, sitting in a popular recreational area that thousands of people had walked through, on trails that had seen hikers for 38 years, were identified as those of Starkie Leroy Swenson. But here's what doesn't make sense, or rather, here's the part that keeps sitting wrong no matter how many times you turn it over. High Cliff State Park is not a remote wilderness accessible only to experienced backcountry hikers. It is a publicly accessible state park with developed trail systems, picnic areas, designated parking, and regular visitor traffic from families, day hikers, and recreationists from across the region. People use it on weekday afternoons. Parents take kids there in summer. Couples walk the trails in fall when the leaves change above Lake Winnebago. The park draws steady foot traffic every single season of the year. Starkie Swenson's remains lay in a secluded section of that park, not in a remote canyon or an unmarked forest, but within a functioning recreational area for 38 years, through thousands of visitors, through multiple investigative inquiries conducted in the general region, through the dedicated work of a forensic anthropologist and his students, searching during the very year the remains were finally found. And then 2 hikers found him on an evening walk, almost by accident, in an area the sheriff's office described as having been undiscovered because of its relative seclusion within the park system. 38 years, a public park, a set of keys with a distinctive keychain that the family recognized immediately from a description, an answer hiding in plain sight the entire time. The Calumet County Sheriff's Office confirmed the identification and turned the investigative results over to the District Attorney's Office for review. The question of whether any additional charges could be brought against John Andrews, given that his plea had, in the view of the law, covered everything related to Starkie's death, was carefully assessed by District Attorney Nathan Haberman. He reviewed the reports. He considered what charges might theoretically apply. The analysis hit a wall almost immediately. Andrews' plea agreement, as his former defense attorney Stephen Glynn explained publicly at the time, had been structured to encompass Andrews' full responsibility for everything that had been done to Starkie Swenson. And the charge that would most directly fit the additional conduct now confirmed concealing a corpse carries a statute of limitations in Wisconsin of 6 years. Andrews had concealed the body in 1983. 32 years had passed since the limitation window closed. Whatever he had done to hide Starkie Swenson in that park, the law had no mechanism left to address it. Andrews had served 24 months in county jail and walked out. He was legally finished with it. The body in the park changed nothing about his legal exposure, because the law had already spent what it had to spend on him. Starkie Swenson's family said publicly that they did not want additional charges pursued. They said what they had wanted, for 38 years, was to bring him home. They had that now, or at least they had the knowledge of where he was, which, after nearly 4 decades, was something. The Neenah Police Department issued a statement when the identification was confirmed. Starkie Swenson had been listed as a missing person with the department until the day the identification came back. He was still, officially, a missing person right up until the moment he wasn't. The file closed. His family had a place to point to on a map, finally, after 38 years. High Cliff State Park is still open. People still hike those trails above Lake Winnebago. They park in the same lots, walk the same paths, take in the same views of the water through the trees. For 38 years, they moved through a landscape that held an answer to a question a family had been asking for longer than some of those hikers had been alive, and none of them knew it. That is the particular cruelty embedded in this case. Not that the answer was impossible to find, but that it was there the entire time, in a place where people walked for pleasure, waiting for 2 hikers on an evening in September 2021 to stumble close enough to notice. Now this is where we shift from a case that eventually produced an answer to one where 3 people heard everything but saw nothing. The parking lot in Menasha, the loud exhaust of a Volkswagen, 3 people listening from an apartment window, waiting for a knock at the door that never came. August 19th, 1992. The town of Menasha, Wisconsin, what is now called Fox Crossing, sitting in the Fox Valley corridor between Appleton and Oshkosh, in the flat stretch of northeastern Wisconsin where the Fox River empties into Lake Winnebago. It was a Tuesday night in late summer. The air was warm, and the evening had the particular quality of ordinary life, wrapping up for the day, people finishing shifts, heading home, making simple plans that had nothing alarming about them. Menasha was the kind of community where people knew their neighbors, where the rhythms of everyday life were predictable in ways that felt safe, where a 20-year-old woman driving 15 minutes from a mall to her boyfriend's apartment was an event so unremarkable it needed no explanation and no precaution. What happened in the parking lot of the Elms apartment complex that night would break something open in this community that didn't fully close for decades. Laurie Depies was 20 years old. She was an artist, a free spirit, the kind of person who expressed herself in specific and deliberate layers she wore. Multiple silver necklaces, bracelets, anklets, and earrings in triple-pierced ears. She had a tattoo on her right ankle in tribal style that her friends described as looking like a squid. She went by Lauriella sometimes, or just Ella, and she was the kind of person who assembled details around herself that made her immediately recognizable, not in a way that was loud or demanding of attention, but in a way that said she had thought about who she was and decided to be it fully. She worked at a clothing store inside the Fox River Mall in Grand Chute. She had a boyfriend named Mark Troughton, and on Tuesday evenings, she sometimes stopped by his apartment at the Elms apartment complex at 310 West Wilson Avenue in the town of Menasha, a drive of about 15 minutes from the mall, along a route she had taken before without incident. That Tuesday evening she was expected. Mark was inside with his sister and a friend, waiting for her to show up and knock on the door. None of them were worried. There was no reason to be. On the night of August 19th, Laurie finished her shift. A coworker walked her out to her car in the mall parking lot, a small act of courtesy that had no particular significance at the time. Laurie got in her car and drove toward Mark's apartment. The drive was short. The route was familiar. She had made it before. This is where the case becomes unlike anything we've covered. Because what happened in the parking lot at 310 West Wilson Avenue that night was witnessed in the most disorienting way possible completely, and not at all. Mark Troughton was inside his apartment with his sister and a friend, waiting for Laurie to arrive. They had been expecting her, and they'd been listening for her specifically, because Laurie's car was impossible to miss. The exhaust on her old Volkswagen was loud, not background noise loud, but distinctively loud, recognizably loud, the kind of engine note that announces a specific person before you can see them, that anyone who knew Laurie would pick out of an evening's worth of ambient sound without any effort at all. At some point between 10:15 and 10:30 that evening, they heard it. The unmistakable rumble of Laurie's Volkswagen pulling into the lot below. They heard the engine cut off, and then, clearly, they heard the car door close. And then Laurie Depies did not walk through the apartment door. Mark waited a minute, then another. He went outside to check. What he found was Laurie's gray Volkswagen parked, locked, sitting exactly where it should be in the complex lot. On top of the hood, a Styrofoam cup of soda. Inside the car, her purse, her overnight bag, her keys, all of it locked inside with the car. No sign of a struggle in the parking lot. No footprints that could be followed in any direction. No drag marks. No witnesses to anything. The cup sat on the hood of the locked car like it had been set down carefully, or abandoned in an instant, and no one could say which. That was the last confirmed time anyone connected to Laurie Depies had any contact with her, and it wasn't even a sighting. It was a sound. A car arriving, a door closing, and then silence where a person should have been. Here's what doesn't make sense. The distance between the parking lot and Mark's apartment door is not significant. The lot is not large. The building is right there. Between the moment that car door slammed, heard clearly by 3 people who were waiting for her, and the moment Mark walked outside to check, the window is measured in minutes, not hours. Laurie Depies was taken from a parking lot within earshot of 3 people who knew exactly what her car sounded like, who were expecting her, who were waiting for her, and not one of them heard anything. No argument, no protest, no sound of a struggle. Just the slam of a door, and then nothing. The investigation that followed was exhaustive by any standard. The unidentified thumbprint lifted from the Styrofoam cup on the hood, its size suggesting, though not confirming, that it came from a man, was preserved as potential evidence and has remained in the file for over 30 years without a confirmed match. Friends, classmates, and coworkers were interviewed at length. Polygraphs were administered to the people who had been waiting for Laurie in the apartment that night. Mark, his sister, and their friend, and every one of them passed. Law enforcement canvassed the area around the apartment complex and the mall, looking for anyone who might have seen something in that parking lot in the window between 10:15 and 10:30. They found no reliable witnesses who could place Laurie anywhere after the car door slammed. The case gained national television exposure on the true crime program Unsolved Mysteries, which at the time was one of the highest profile platforms available for cold cases, and later on, the investigation Discovery series Disappeared. Each broadcast brought a surge of tips to the Menasha Police Department. Tips were logged, assigned, and worked for weeks and months. None of them produced a verifiable lead that could be developed into action against any specific person. Now this is where the investigation took a turn that generated enormous attention and ultimately left investigators no closer to an answer. In 2010, a convicted killer and serial predator named Larry Dwayne Hall came forward from federal prison in North Carolina, where he was serving a life sentence for the kidnapping of a 15-year-old girl named Jessica Roach, whose body had been found in an Indiana cornfield in 1993. Hall had been a suspect in Laurie Depies' case as far back as 1995, and investigators had looked at him in connection with the disappearances of other young women across multiple Midwest states. Hall had a documented history of targeting young women and a geography of movement that placed him in the right places at the right times for multiple cold cases. In 2010, he confessed specifically to Laurie's disappearance. He told investigators he had kidnapped and killed her. He provided information about where he believed he had buried her remains. A formal, dedicated search was organized at the location Hall indicated. Investigators went to that site with the information he had given them and conducted a physical examination. They found nothing. No remains. No physical evidence at the site. No corroborating detail that could be independently verified through the forensic search. The confession could not be substantiated. No charges were filed in connection with Laurie's case based on Hall's statement. Investigators working other cases where Hall had also claimed involvement, including the Reitler case in Indiana, have faced similar results. Claims that are specific enough to be disturbing, and evidence insufficient to confirm them. Hall remains in federal prison. His confession to Laurie's disappearance sits in a file that is still open. Police have offered their best assessment of what likely happened that night in the parking lot at 310 West Wilson Avenue. Their working theory, developed over years of investigation, is that Laurie did not go willingly with a stranger. The parking lot was not isolated. The building was right there. The people waiting for her knew her car. Someone appearing in that lot at that moment and successfully taking Laurie without her making any sound loud enough to be heard would be, statistically, very difficult to pull off, unless Laurie had a reason to go along, at least initially. Investigators have leaned toward the possibility that whoever was in that parking lot was someone Laurie recognized, someone who appeared at precisely the right moment, who she trusted enough to approach, who had planned to be there and had timed it to that narrow window between the car and the apartment door. The trust is what made the silence possible. The trust is what made 3 people inside hear nothing but a door. No arrests have ever been made in Laurie Depies' case. No remains have ever been found. There has been no activity on her bank accounts or social security number since August 19, 1992, a detail that investigators cite as meaningful because it suggests strongly that Laurie is not living somewhere under a different name. The Fox Crossing Police Department, which succeeded the Menasha Department as the jurisdiction evolved, continues to list the case as active. A season of the Cold Case, Frozen Tundra podcast, was dedicated entirely to Laurie's case, working through suspects, evidence, and theories in granular detail. The season brought fresh attention and new tips to the department. It also brought renewed focus on the life of a 20-year-old artist with triple-pierced ears and a squid tattoo on her ankle, which is exactly what the people who remember her most want, for people to know who she was, not just how she vanished. The soda cup sat on the hood of her locked Volkswagen through whatever happened next and into the next morning and beyond. A thumbprint on the side of it that nobody has ever been able to name. A cold engine ticking down in a quiet parking lot in the Fox Valley, while 3 people inside an apartment waited for a knock that was never going to come. Hit subscribe if you want to keep going deeper on cases like this one. The next case doesn't involve one person. It involves a mother, a son, a husband, a dog named Hunter, and a family truck that was found wiped clean of fingerprints with 2,600 miles on it that no one could account for. An entire family gone on the 4th of July weekend, 1998, and an answer that is still only partly there. July 2nd, 1998. Helenville, Wisconsin. Jefferson County, again, the same county that gave us Georgia Jean Weckler on a rainy farm lane in 1947, and Kathy Sjoberg stepping out of a prom party into the dark in 1974. Jefferson County sits in the rolling dairy farmland between Madison and Milwaukee, a landscape of modest townships and family properties that have passed through generations. And in the summer of 1998, the Krnak family lived on a property on Lunt Road in the rural township of Helenville. A quiet house, a quiet road, a family with roots in the area, going back years. The 4th of July weekend was coming. The plan was simple: load up the truck, drive north to their summer cabin near Coloma in Waukesha County, maybe 3 hours up Highway 51, and spend the holiday the way Wisconsin families have always spent it, by a lake, with fireworks somewhere in the distance, and a dog that goes crazy every time one goes off. The family was Alan Krnak, who was in his early 50s and worked a steady job. His wife Donna, who was 52, blonde, and known to family and friends as a warm and dependable presence in the community. Their 21-year-old son Thomas, quiet and studious, who was enrolled at the University of Wisconsin-Whitewater, and a Cocker Spaniel named Hunter, who was as much a part of the household as any of them. There was a 5th member of the household present on that day, the family's older son, whose name at the time was Andrew Krnak, who was 29 years old, unemployed, and living with his parents while carrying a significant load of student loan debt from his own time at Whitewater. He was not making the trip to Coloma with the family. He was staying behind. That day, July 2nd, 1998, Alan took a phone call at work that his coworkers later testified had visibly shaken him. He left work early, telling colleagues he had a family emergency and that he might have to attend a funeral. The older son later admitted to making that call. He said the reason he called was that he was working on his parents' car and couldn't locate a tool he needed. Alan's coworkers found that explanation difficult to reconcile with the way he had reacted to the call. A man who leaves work midday, citing the possibility of a funeral, does not typically do so because someone can't find a wrench. Whatever happened inside the house on Lunt Road that afternoon, no forensic examination ever revealed a trace of it. No blood, no physical disruption. Nothing that looked, to the investigators who later combed through it, like a crime scene. The house appeared completely normal. And yet Alan, Donna, Thomas, and Hunter never arrived at the cabin in Coloma. They never made a single stop that anyone could document. They were simply gone. Here's the critical detail. The older son who, in the days immediately after the family's disappearance, legally changed his name to Derek Anderson and has been referred to that way in all subsequent media and legal coverage, reported the family missing 7 days later. 7 days. His explanation was that he had expected them to return from the cabin on a certain date, and when they hadn't, he'd waited through the week before filing a report. Investigators noted the delay. They always note the delay. On July 10th, 8 days after the family was last seen, the Krnak family's black Chevrolet truck was located near Reedsburg in Sauk County, about an hour's drive from Helenville, in a direction that is not toward Coloma, not toward anywhere the family was supposed to be going. The truck had been wiped. Fingerprints, none. Luggage, none. The Krnak's belongings, the things a family packs for a holiday weekend, were gone. The truck itself showed signs of having been cleaned, and when investigators looked at the odometer, they found something that stopped them cold. There were approximately 2,618 unaccounted for miles on that vehicle. 2,618 miles. The straight-line distance from Helenville, Wisconsin, to the area of North Carolina, where Alan Krnak's remains were eventually recovered, is approximately 780 miles each way, meaning a round trip runs close to 1,560 miles. The truck's extra mileage was consistent, investigators noted, with a trip to North Carolina and back, with additional driving unaccounted for. Think about that for a moment. Someone drove a family truck more than 2,000 miles and abandoned it in a county 1 hour from the starting point. The investigation centered immediately and heavily on Derek Anderson, the older son who had renamed himself within days of the family's disappearance. His background was examined in detail. He was unemployed and living with his parents while carrying substantial student loan debt, tens of thousands of dollars. Investigators determined which, in at least some instances, had been fraudulently obtained through false Pell Grant applications submitted in Wisconsin Arizona, and North Carolina. That last geography, North Carolina, was a detail that became more significant as the investigation progressed. Court records would later show that Alan Krnak's co-workers testified that he had told them his relationship with this older son was troubled and had turned violent. Alan had reportedly told people at his workplace that this son had physically attacked him, that there had been a serious incident. The family's combined estate, Alan and Donna's accumulated assets, their property, their retirement was estimated by prosecutors at between $550,000 and $600,000 at the time of the family's disappearance. As the sole surviving family member, Anderson stood to inherit all of it. In 1999, a set of skeletal remains was discovered in the Roy Taylor Forest in North Carolina, a densely wooded area in the western part of the state. Far from any obvious reason in Helenville, Wisconsin family would have traveled there. 2 years later, in 2001, DNA testing confirmed that those remains belonged to Alan Krnak. Found near Alan's body, the remains of a small dog, consistent in size and type with a Cocker Spaniel hunter, a woman's t-shirt, a pair of men's briefs, and, unmistakably, Donna Krnak's wedding ring. Donna and Thomas Krnak have never been found. The North Carolina discovery closed one piece of the question. Alan was dead, and someone had driven him more than 700 miles from Jefferson County to put him in those woods, but it opened a much larger one. Investigators had always suspected where the truck's extra mileage had come from. Now they had confirmation that it had been to North Carolina. What they still didn't have was any physical evidence establishing what had happened to Donna and Thomas, or where they were. The wedding ring found with Alan suggested Donna had been in the same general area at some point, but her remains, and Thomas's, were nowhere in the Roy Taylor Forest or anywhere else investigators searched. Now this is where the case turns dark, in a direction that is specific to this family and devastating in its particular logic. In 2006, Derek Anderson went to trial for the murder of his father Alan. The case had taken years to build, partly because it relied heavily on circumstantial evidence in the absence of any physical crime scene in Wisconsin. The prosecution constructed its argument around the financial motive, the truck mileage, the name change in the days after the family vanished, the 7-day delay before reporting them missing, the testimony from Alan's co-workers about violence and a profoundly broken relationship, and the geography of North Carolina, a state where Anderson had submitted fraudulent financial aid applications and had documented connections, however tenuous. Anderson pleaded not guilty. His defense team argued clearly and correctly that there was no physical evidence at the Helenville house connecting their client to any crime. No blood, no DNA at the scene, no established crime scene in Wisconsin. Those facts were true. The jury heard all of it, deliberated, and returned a verdict of guilty on the charge of first-degree intentional homicide. Anderson was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He has never been charged in the deaths or disappearances of his mother Donna or his brother Thomas. That distinction, convicted for one, uncharged for two, sits at the center of what makes this case so difficult to fully close. Prosecutors and investigators have stated publicly that they believe Anderson is responsible for all 3 deaths and for what happened to Donna and Thomas. But belief and proof operate differently in a courtroom. In the absence of Donna and Thomas's remains, and without a crime scene in Wisconsin that could be tied to the days before the family's disappearance, the evidentiary threshold for additional charges was never met. The locations of Donna Krnak and Thomas Krnak, mother and son, a woman's wedding ring in a North Carolina forest, a young man who was supposed to be finishing his studies, remain officially unknown. The Jefferson County case files for both of them are still open. Somewhere along those 2,618 miles, in the high summer of 1998, a family of 3 and their dog were transported across 1,000 miles of American landscape and disappeared into it. The Cocker Spaniel, whose remains were found near Allen in the Roy Taylor Forest, had been carried from the house on Lunt Road, where he had lived his whole life, to a set of woods he had never known. Donna's wedding ring ended up in a state that nothing in the public record suggests she had ever visited. And the older son, who changed his name in the days immediately after his family vanished, is now serving a life sentence in a Wisconsin prison, while the files for his mother and brother remain open, still waiting for an answer that has never come. Jefferson County still carries Donna Krnak and Thomas Krnak as missing persons. Their photographs remain in the state database. The cabin near Coloma that the family was driving toward on July 2nd, 1998 is still there. The Lunt Road property, where nothing forensically wrong was ever established, sat empty of answers then, and remains empty of them now. And that same summer 1998, the same year the Krnaks vanished from Jefferson County, a second disappearance shook a completely different corner of Wisconsin, in a way that the city of Green Bay still hasn't fully resolved. A 19-year-old college student named Amber Wilde was months pregnant and newly enrolled at the University of Wisconsin-Green Bay when she stepped out of her apartment on a September morning and never came back. Her car turned up locked near Lambeau Field with her phone, her purse, and her keys still inside. 900 unaccounted for miles on the odometer, and a city that has been digging holes in Shawano and Portage and a dozen other counties for over 25 years, looking for someone whose case is still officially a homicide investigation, with persons of interest who have never been charged. September 23rd, 1998, Green Bay, Wisconsin. Football season was already underway, and in Green Bay that means something specific about the mood of the city, a particular kind of energy that settles over the place when the Packers are playing. A city that has organized part of its identity around a stadium and what happens inside it. Amber Lynn Wilde lived on the east side of Green Bay, in an apartment she kept on her own. She was 19 years old. She had just transferred to the University of Wisconsin-Green Bay 3 weeks earlier, arriving on a full scholarship with plans to study pre-medicine and eventually become a pediatrician. She had chosen a specific, demanding path for herself, and had chosen it with enough clarity that she had already secured the funding to pursue it. She was barely 3 weeks into her new life at that campus, hadn't yet had time to settle into routines, hadn't had time to get fully comfortable, was still in that period where a new place is exciting but not yet home. And then September 23rd happened. But first, something small and ordinary occurred that morning that would become significant later. Amber was involved in a minor car accident on the roads around Green Bay. It wasn't serious, the kind of low-speed collision that is stressful but not dangerous. Her head hit the windshield on impact, and she had a headache afterward, but she was not badly injured. The other driver involved in the collision called Amber at her apartment that evening to work out the details of the damage. That call connected. The conversation was brief and ordinary, two people after a fender bender, handling the aftermath. That phone call is one of the last confirmed contacts anyone had with Amber Wilde. Amber was months pregnant at the time of her disappearance. She had become pregnant during a relationship with a man who was engaged to be married to someone else. He denied paternity. He had reportedly asked Amber, more than once, to end the pregnancy. She refused firmly, repeatedly, without ambiguity. She wanted the baby. She wanted the child's father to be part of the child's life. According to journal entries that investigators later accessed, Amber had told the man's fiancé and his mother about the pregnancy approximately a month before she disappeared. That disclosure had not been received calmly. It had generated the kind of reaction that can escalate situations well past where they started. Amber's aunt, Laurie Depies, said in interviews that she believed Amber's pregnancy and the pressure Amber was putting on the man to acknowledge the child was directly and causally connected to what happened to her. Phone records that investigators reviewed showed approximately 60 calls between Amber and this man over the course of the months they had been in contact. He had told people he barely knew her. The phone records said otherwise. He was among the persons of interest that investigators identified. He has never been charged. Here's the critical detail. On the morning of September 24th, Amber's father called her apartment to wake her up for her 1 o'clock class. She didn't answer. He called again. Still no answer. Amber then missed that class, missed a scheduled eye doctor's appointment, and failed to appear for a series of other obligations, all in a single day. All things that were completely out of character for her. A young woman on a full scholarship who had just arrived at a new university and was trying to build a life there does not simply stop responding. The family reported her missing. The Green Bay Police Department opened a case. Her car was found in a parking lot near Lambeau Field. Inside, still locked in the vehicle, her purse, her cell phone, her keys, Everything a person needs to function in a day was sitting inside that car, untouched, as if she had stepped out for a moment and expected to be right back. There was no indication of a struggle at the vehicle, no one who had seen her leave. The car was just there, and Amber was not. But here's what doesn't make sense, and what has driven this case through 25 years of active investigation. There were approximately 900 unaccounted for miles on Amber's vehicle. 900 miles. That is not a person who parked near Lambeau and walked around the corner. That is a car that went somewhere or was driven somewhere before being left in that lot. Where those miles went and who put them there is officially unknown. Investigators have never publicly confirmed whether Amber drove those miles herself, whether her car was used by someone else after something happened to her, or what the geography of those 900 miles looks like. They have never said, because they do not know or have not disclosed what they know. Green Bay police, in the years after Amber's disappearance, made the determination that they were investigating a homicide. They developed persons of interest. Those persons of interest have never been named publicly, because naming uncharged individuals as suspects in a homicide investigation carries legal consequences that investigators navigated carefully. What detectives have said publicly is that they believe more than one person is responsible for Amber's disappearance and presumed death, that it wasn't a solo act, that there are people who know things, who have known things for decades, and who have not come forward. Detective David Graff, one of the Green Bay investigators who worked the case for years, said publicly that he believed someone could still step forward and be what he called a hero, someone who knew, who told the truth, and who gave the Wilde family what they have been waiting for since 1998. The investigation generated enormous activity over the years that followed. Searches were conducted in Kewaunee County and in Portage County areas, where credible tips had pointed investigators, and those digs were not symbolic efforts. They were serious, resource-intensive searches of land that investigators had reason to believe might hold answers. Every search came up empty. Detectives Graff and Lee Kingston, who took over the case in its later years, continued to follow leads as they came in, traveling to interview witnesses, revisiting evidence, re-examining the timeline. The investigation produced persons of interest. Those persons of interest have never been named publicly, because law enforcement in Wisconsin has consistently protected the legal standing of people who have not been charged, and naming uncharged individuals as suspects in an active homicide investigation carries consequences that investigators navigated with care. What detectives have said publicly, across multiple years of interviews, is that they believe more than one person is responsible for Amber's disappearance and presumed death, that there are people in the community who know what happened, that the silence around this case is not the silence of people who don't know, it's the silence of people who have chosen not to speak. Detective Graff said publicly that he believed someone could step forward, do what he called the right thing, and give the Wilde family what they have been waiting for since 1998. In 2017, the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit became formally involved in Amber's case. That bears repeating. The BAU, a federal unit that specializes in the psychology of violent crime, that gets called in when local and state investigators have exhausted conventional approaches and need a different set of analytical tools applied to the evidence. Their involvement signals a federal-level assessment that the Wilde case warranted exactly that. Whether the BAU's involvement has produced actionable results in the years since is not a matter of public record. What is public is that nearly 27 years after Amber Wilde disappeared from Green Bay, her case remains an active homicide investigation with no arrests. Amber's family has marked the anniversary of her disappearance every September 23rd for more than 25 years. They gather at the date. They remember. Every year, on the same calendar day, the same family stands in the same absence and refuses to let it become invisible. Her aunt, Laurie Depies, described Amber in interviews as family-oriented, always present the kind of person who showed up to things, who remembered birthdays, who was there at Christmas and at the smaller moments in between. The family shared home videos with local television stations in the years around the case's 25th anniversary. Footage from that last Christmas Amber spent with them. recordings from family gatherings where she is present and young and unaware of what is coming. Those videos are hard to watch. They show a 19-year-old who is completely alive in the specific, ordinary way that 19-year-olds are alive, and they make the absence feel more concrete, not less. Her father, who had called her apartment that morning to make sure she was up for class, has given interviews across the years in which the hope that someone will come forward is the through line. He has not stopped hoping. Neither has her aunt. Neither, it seems, has the Green Bay Police Department, which continues to carry this case as an active homicide investigation despite the passage of more than a quarter century. Amber Wilde was 19 years old. She was months pregnant. She had a full scholarship at a university she had just arrived at, and plans she had made for a future she intended to build. Somewhere in the margin between a minor car accident on the morning of September 23rd and a locked car near Lambeau Field with 900 unexplained miles on it, a life ended. The Green Bay Police Department continues to investigate it as a homicide. The persons of interest in this case have never faced charges, and the baby the child Amber refused to stop fighting for was never born. A phone sitting untouched in a locked car in the shadow of a stadium. A purse and a set of keys that belonged to someone who was supposed to be back. A family gathering every September to mark an anniversary that should never have started counting. 900 unaccounted for miles that go nowhere on the public record, and somewhere in Shawano County, or Portage County, or somewhere else entirely along a route that nobody has traced an answer that 25 years of digging hasn't found yet. The Green Bay Police Department is still looking. So is the FBI, and the persons of interest in this case are still out there, carrying whatever they know. The next case takes us south to Fitchburg, just outside Madison, in the fall of 2004. A 27-year-old who led two very different lives disappeared from a house where a vinyl record was still turning on the turntable. And the investigation that followed pulled back a curtain on one of the largest marijuana distribution operations in central Wisconsin's recent history, a curtain that people went to federal prison rather than lift, and that left a mother standing on a road holding a sign for 9 years. November 8th, 2004. Fitchburg, Wisconsin. A small city pressed up against the southern edge of Madison, sitting in Dane County where the college town energy of the state capital bleeds out into a landscape of bike paths, rural roads, and modest neighborhoods. Amos Mortier was 27 years old. He rented a house on Lacey Road, a rural stretch on the quieter side of Fitchburg, and from the outside, his life looked like the kind of low-footprint existence that made sense for someone in his position. He was a student at Madison Area Technical College, studying botany and ecology, aiming eventually toward a life as an organic farmer. He worked as an electrician when he needed income. He made and sold handcrafted jewelry. He had a serious vinyl collection, the kind that fills walls, the kind that takes years to build and that movers joke about when they're asked to carry it. He DJ'd on the side and had the sound equipment to prove it. He loved hiking and camping and long walks through the land around Fitchburg with his dog, a husky mix Malamute named Gnosis, who was as much a companion as any animal Amos had ever had. He had the kind of life that people build when they've decided what matters to them and arranged everything around it. And then, on November 8th, 2004, he walked out of it or was walked out of it and was never seen again. Here's how the day unfolded, as best investigators were able to reconstruct it. Amos had been on campus at Madison Area Technical College for a class. His last confirmed cell phone record placed him there in the early afternoon, around 1:20 p.m. He apparently returned home to Lacey Road sometime after that. At some point that afternoon, he made a phone call. That call was the last anyone heard from him. He was not reported missing for approximately a week, a delay that would cost investigators enormously, because the window in which a trail might have been followed closed before anyone began looking. When Amos's friends finally went to the house on Lacey Road after days of unanswered calls, this is what they found. The front door was unlocked. Inside, the stereo was on. Near the turntables, a half-rolled joint sat in a tray. The needle on a vinyl record was riding in the run-out groove, the spinning but finished section at the end of a side, where the record just goes around in silence until someone lifts the arm. The visual implication was impossible to ignore. Something had interrupted Amos at the exact moment he was at his turntables, listening to music, living his life. His wallet was inside the house. His keys were inside. His cell phone was inside. Both of his cars were parked where they should be. His backpack was in one of the cars, still containing his lab notes from his class earlier that day. And Gnosis was gone. Amos's friends were alarmed enough that they searched the surrounding fields and swamp near Lacey Road for days, calling for Amos and for the dog, assuming he might have injured himself on a walk. They found nothing. 5 rainy days of searching by friends and family, and nothing. Then, about a week after Amos disappeared, one of his friends found Gnosis at a neighbor's house. The dog was alive, appeared to be okay, had been fed and watered, but his collar was gone. The collar had been removed. Amos's friends were jubilant for a moment at finding Gnosis alive, and then the reality of what that detail meant settled over them like weather. Someone had taken the collar off the dog. Amos would not have left his dog. The dog being alive and cared for without its collar meant someone else had made decisions about that animal. Whatever had happened to Amos, someone else had handled the aftermath. Now this is where the case turns dark in a direction nobody in Amos's circle had anticipated. Because what investigators found when they dug into his life is that Amos Mortier had been leading 2 of them. The botany student and hiker and vinyl collector on one side, and on the other, one of the larger marijuana distribution operations in central Wisconsin, one that investigators ultimately described as handling somewhere in the range of 150 pounds of Canadian-sourced marijuana per month, shipped from New York by a former University of Wisconsin-Madison student named Reed Rogala, divided into smaller quantities, and distributed through a network of people who bought and sold for Amos across the Madison area. Rogala testified before a federal grand jury in 2007. By then, the DEA and federal prosecutors had been involved in the case for years. The scope of the operation was significant enough that when it unraveled, 5 people chose federal prison rather than cooperate with investigators who were trying to find out what happened to Amos. Here's the critical detail. In the days before he disappeared, Amos and Rogala had been dealing with a serious problem. A longtime associate, a man Amos had known and trusted, owed approximately $80,000 for marijuana he had received but not paid for. That debt, and what to do about it, had been the active topic of conversation in Amos's circle in the days leading up to November 8th. Multiple witnesses later testified that the associate was aware Amos intended to collect. Fitchburg police announced in April of 2005 that they believed Amos's disappearance was a homicide, and that the homicide was directly connected to that marijuana debt. They identified persons of interest, people they believed had motive, opportunity, and knowledge of what happened. They searched a specific property connected to one of those persons in April of 2005. They did not find Amos. They could not gather sufficient evidence for criminal charges against anyone. People who knew things accepted federal prison sentences on drug charges rather than cooperate with investigators. The investigation moved through state proceedings and into federal grand juries. In September of 2006, more than 2 years after Amos disappeared, a witness appeared before the federal grand jury and testified to having been told by a specific individual, whom investigators treated as a suspect, that Amos had been stabbed, that his body had been disposed of in a specific and disturbing manner, and that the person giving that account had provided details that were precise enough to be taken seriously. Investigators attempted to verify and locate physical evidence consistent with that testimony. They were unable to do so. No remains of Amos Mortier have ever been recovered. A $25,000 reward has been offered for information leading to his whereabouts. It has not been claimed. Nathan Comp, a journalist based in Madison, spent years investigating the Mortier case from the outside in. He published detailed reporting in the Isthmus, Madison's alternative weekly, building out the fullest public picture of what the grand jury evidence and drug investigation had revealed. He and a filmmaker named Christina Motwani launched a Kickstarter campaign in 2016 to fund a documentary about the case, arguing that confidential police documents had been leaked to them that revealed significant investigative failures, that the information needed to solve the case had been in front of investigators within the first 3 days, and that subsequent tunnel vision had compounded rather than resolved those early errors. Fitchburg police disputed that characterization. The documentary was not completed. The case remained where it has always been: a homicide without a charge, a body without a location, a mother on a roadside with a sign. But here's what doesn't make sense, and what Amos's mother, Margie Milutinovich, spent more than a decade pointing out on the roadside near Lacey Road. When his friends entered that house and found the half-rolled joint, the spinning record, the empty food bowl, they removed a safe from the premises before calling police. That safe, when investigators eventually tracked it down, was empty. The evidence inside whatever that safe held was gone before law enforcement ever arrived. Margie believed, and said publicly, that the Fitchburg Police Department's tunnel vision on the drug angle had cost the investigation its best early window, and that people who might have been pressed harder in the initial days had been allowed to drift away while the focus narrowed. Investigators responded that they had pursued every lead available. The argument never fully resolved. The case never fully resolved. Every year, on November 8th, for more than a decade after Amos disappeared, Margie Milutinovich stood outside the house on Lacey Road with a large poster bearing her son's face. She stood on the shoulder of that road and held it up for the cars that went past, because the cars on Lacey Road might contain someone who knew something, or someone who knew someone who knew something, or someone who would see Amos's face on a sign and carry it somewhere where it would eventually reach the right person. She did this year after year, in the Wisconsin November, in the cold. She did it because there was nothing else she could do. She gave interviews. She maintained a website dedicated to her son. She worked the phones when tips came in. She said in every interview that she believed the Fitchburg Police Department had made decisions in the first days of the investigation that cost the case its best window, that the focus on the drug angle had become a set of blinders, and that people who should have been pressed harder in the first week had instead been given time to coordinate their accounts and their silences. Margie Milutinovich is not a woman who used that grief quietly. She used it the only way available to her, which was loudly and in public, on the side of a road in Fitchburg, holding her son's face up to the traffic, a needle riding the run-out groove of a record no one came back to lift. A dog with no collar, fed and watered at a neighbor's house, alive and confused, and missing the person who had walked him on those Fitchburg trails every day. And somewhere south of Madison, in the hands of a small number of people who have kept their silence for more than 20 years. An answer that has never been given to the woman who stood on Lacey Road every November with her son's face on a sign. The next one is 15 years old, weeks away from her 16th birthday. She got into a car with her brother's friend on an August evening in a small northern Wisconsin town, and she hasn't been seen since. The investigation has a last confirmed name, the last person known to be with her, and no charges have ever been filed in connection with her disappearance. The case has a viral hoax video that went worldwide, a $20,000 FBI reward that has never been claimed, and a condemned house in Wausau that she had no logical reason to visit on the night she vanished. August 11th, 2009, Antigo, Wisconsin. Langlade County, in the north-central part of the state, lake country, forest country, the kind of small city where the summer feels wide open and teenagers know each other's families going back 2 generations. Antigo sits roughly 100 miles north of Wausau, surrounded by the Nicolet National Forest and the kind of landscape that becomes a different creature after dark, when the main street goes quiet and the distances between houses start to feel significant. Kayla Berg was 15 years old. She had been born in Wausau and had grown up in Antigo, but the spring and early summer of 2009 had been unsettled. Her mother, Hope, had moved her and her older brother Jimmy to Texas in May, trying to build something new. But Kayla was homesick. She was a gymnast, a dancer, passionate and talented enough that she had been excited about trying out for the Antigo High School gymnastics team in the fall. There was no gymnastics program at the high school in Texas. That absence mattered to her. By early August, she and her mother were back in Antigo, and Kayla was spending the last few weeks of summer the way teenagers do, reconnecting with friends, catching up on the time she'd been gone, moving between her mother's place and her father James's house on the north side of town. She was 2 weeks shy of her 16th birthday. She didn't own a cell phone. She didn't have a driver's license. She moved around Antigo on foot and in other people's cars, the way kids in small towns always have, trusting the geography, trusting the people. On the afternoon of August 11th, Kayla was at her father's house. At around 8:30 that evening, she accepted a ride from a 24-year-old man, a friend of her older brother Jimmy's. The two of them drove around Antigo for a while. They stopped at the McDonald's on the main strip, where Kayla briefly went inside to say hello to a friend who was working a shift there. That friend was the last person outside the car who can be confirmed to have seen Kayla. From that McDonald's, the man drove south. According to his account, the only account he drove Kayla approximately 34 miles southwest to Wausau on Highway 51, because she had asked him to drop her at the house of her boyfriend Miguel. He said he dropped her off at around 10 o'clock at night in front of that house, saw her walk toward the door, and drove back to Antigo. Here's the critical detail that investigators kept returning to, that made no sense from the moment it surfaced. Kayla knew that Miguel no longer lived at that house. She had known for weeks. The address her companion described a house across the street from a nursing home on a residential block in downtown Wausau, had been condemned by the city health department prior to August 11th and was in the process of being renovated. Miguel had already moved to a new place. Not only did Kayla know this, she had personally attended a party at Miguel's new address the week before. She had been there. She had the new address. There was no reason, none that any investigator could identify, none that her family could imagine, for Kayla to ask to be dropped at a house she knew was empty, at a condemned property, in a city 34 miles from where she started, at 10 o'clock at night, without a phone. Kayla Berg was not reported missing for 6 days. 6 days. The delay was not the result of indifference. It came from a tangle of family communication, each parent assuming Kayla was with the other. The extended family structure of a household where she divided her time between two homes, meaning no single person had full visibility into her daily movements. Her mother, Hope, eventually realized, working through the confusion, that no one had actually confirmed seeing or speaking with Kayla since the night of August 11th. On August 17th, Hope went to the Antigo Police Department and filed a missing person report. She was told that her daughter had to be missing a certain amount of time before a report could be formally processed. She pushed back. The initial classification, when it was entered, was runaway. Hope Berg was insistent from the very beginning that her daughter had not run away. Kayla had no history of it, no reason for it, nothing in her makeup or her circumstances that pointed in that direction. She was 2 weeks from her 16th birthday. She was excited about the gymnastics team. She had just come home from Texas because she missed Antigo. Within 48 hours of the report being filed, investigators upgraded the case from runaway to endangered, missing a classification that reflected their own assessment that something had gone wrong, that this was not a teenager who had chosen to disappear. Now this is where the case turns dark, not dramatically but quietly and systematically, in the way that cold cases accumulate their weight. The man who had driven Kayla to Wausau, the last person confirmed to be with her, was questioned by investigators. He cooperated initially, then stopped cooperating. In October of 2009, he was arrested and charged with a count of second-degree reckless endangerment, a charge related to what investigators believed had happened during that car ride on the night of August 11th, involving controlled substances and a 15-year-old. That charge was later dismissed by prosecutors, citing insufficient evidence for a conviction. He has never been charged in connection with Kayla's disappearance itself. He has not been publicly named as a suspect. He is identified in media coverage as the last known person with Kayla, which is simply the factual record. But here's what doesn't make sense. Kayla had no phone to be tracked. The only account of where she went after leaving Antigo is one person's word. There is no physical evidence placing Kayla at the Wausau address. No one at the house, no neighbor, no passerby reported seeing a teenage girl arrive on foot at a condemned property at 10 o'clock on a Tuesday night. The destination she supposedly asked for had no logical purpose. The drive itself, a 34-mile journey south in the dark with an older man, is the last thing anyone can place Kayla in with any confidence. The Antigo Police Department has maintained the position, in every interview across 16 years, that this is not a cold case, that it is an active, ongoing investigation. Captain Daniel Dulé, who was a new detective sergeant when Kayla disappeared and has worked the case ever since, has stated repeatedly that no one has been ruled out, that there are people who have information, that what happened to Kayla Berg is known to at least some of the people who have been questioned, and that those people have chosen not to share it. In 2017, the Kayla Berg case was featured on a full episode of the investigation discovery series, Disappeared, a program that had now featured multiple Wisconsin cases in its run and had a track record of generating new tips and attention for families who had been waiting for years. The episode was titled The Last Summer. It covered Kayla's background, the night of August 11th, the investigation, and the questions that remained unanswered. It brought a new wave of public attention to the case and, according to the Antigo Police Department, produced additional tips that were worked and followed up on. It did not produce an answer. In 2016, a disturbing video resurfaced online, originally posted in October 2009, 2 months after Kayla vanished. The video showed a young woman in distress in what appeared to be a basement setting, and viewers began circulating it with claims that the woman in the video was Kayla Berg. The Antigo Police Department and the FBI investigated quickly. Investigators identified and located the people in the video within days. The video was a hoax staged, unrelated to Kayla's case, the people in it not connected to her in any way. It was confirmed fake and publicly debunked. Kayla's mother, Hope, called the episode a nightmare. The only value that came out of it, she said, was that Kayla's name went worldwide for a news cycle, which at least kept the case visible. The cruelty of the hoax, the way it raised and then obliterated a moment of hope, was something Hope Berg never entirely forgave. The FBI offered a $20,000 reward for information, leading to the arrest and conviction of anyone responsible for whatever crime had been committed against Kayla. That reward has never been claimed. In December of 2023, 14 years after Kayla disappeared, the Antigo Police Department received a tip from an inmate within the Wisconsin state prison system. The information provided was specific enough that investigators conducted a search in Kewaunee County on the eastern shore of Wisconsin near Green Bay, more than 100 miles from Antigo. The search produced nothing. Kayla Berg would be 31 years old today. A bench in Antigo's city park now carries a plaque in her memory, a tangible, permanent marker in a community that has never stopped carrying her absence. The bench was funded quickly after Hope Berg mentioned the idea publicly. A single anonymous donor covered the full cost within days. Her mother has said in recent interviews that she thinks about Kayla every single day, not as something that gets easier with time, but as something that becomes the permanent texture of everything else. She says she wants to know what happened. Not a theory, not a possibility, the actual answer. She says she believes someone knows. She says she has believed that since 2009, and nothing in 16 years has given her a reason to stop. The Antigo Police Department continues to investigate. Captain Dooley has said that the department will keep working it for as long as it takes, that anyone with information, no matter how small it seems to them, should call, that the case is alive, that Kayla is not forgotten. A porch light off at a condemned house in Wausau on a Tuesday night. A 34-mile drive down a dark highway that only one person can account for, to a destination that made no logical sense. And a memorial bench in a city park in Antigo, with a plaque, in a town that has been waiting for 16 years. The last case is the one that ends at a water park. A 6-year-old boy and his mother checking out of a resort in Wisconsin Dells on a May morning in 2011. Security cameras capture it clearly. And then, 4 hours later, somewhere on a rural Illinois highway, the boy is gone, and the only person who knew where he went is dead in a motel room in Rockford, with a note that says he's safe and will never be found. May 11th, 2011. Aurora, Illinois. A note at the outset. Timmothy Pitzen was born in Aurora and lived there with his parents. He is an Illinois child. But the last confirmed sighting of him anywhere on any camera, by any witness, was in Wisconsin Dells, Wisconsin. That is why this case is on this list, because the moment he steps off the public record, he steps off it in this state. And because what happened in Wisconsin Dells on the morning of May 13th, 2011 is the last thing anyone knows for certain about where he was. To understand what happened in Wisconsin Dells, you have to start 2 days earlier, in Aurora. Timothy James Pitzen was 6 years old. He was an only child, born on October 18th, 2004. He lived with both his parents, James Pitzen, his father, and Amy Pitzen, his mother, in Aurora. His kindergarten class at Greenman Elementary School knew him as a regular, cheerful little kid who sat on the floor with his classmates and talked about the things 6-year-olds talk about. His teacher, Cheryl Broach, knew him as a presence in her classroom, a child whose absence would be noticed. On the morning of May 11th, 2011, his father James dropped him off at school as usual. Standard Wednesday drop-off. Nothing unusual. But within the first hour of that school day, something changed. Amy Pitzen arrived at Greenman Elementary School between 8 to 10 and 8:15 in the morning. She told school officials there had been a family emergency and signed Timothy out of his kindergarten class. There was no family emergency. Investigators determined later that the emergency Amy described to the school did not exist. She had fabricated it. What she was doing, whether she had been planning it for weeks or whether it was something that broke open on that particular Wednesday, is a question that was never fully answered. What is known is that Amy Pitzen had a documented history of mental health struggles, and that the Pitzen marriage was under severe strain in early 2011. Divorce appeared to be coming. Amy was terrified, by accounts from her own family, that her mental health history would be used against her in a custody dispute. She believed she might lose access to Timothy. Her sister-in-law told NBC in November of 2022 that Amy's fear about custody had been building for months, and that her loyalty to her son was real and deep, even as her mental state deteriorated. In the weeks before May 11th, Amy had reportedly left home for a brief period at least once before. This time, she took Timothy with her, and this time, she didn't turn back. After signing Timothy out, Amy dropped her car off at an auto repair shop around 10 o'clock that morning. An employee drove her and Timothy to the Brookfield Zoo in suburban Chicago, where they spent the rest of the afternoon. They returned to the repair shop at 3 in the afternoon, retrieved the car, and drove north toward Wisconsin. That evening, they checked into the Key Lime Cove Resort in Gurnee, Illinois, an indoor water park hotel. They spent the night. The next morning, May 12th, Amy and Timothy drove north again. They crossed into Wisconsin and arrived at the Kalahari Resort in Wisconsin Dells, one of the largest indoor water park resorts in the country. A sprawling complex of slides and wave pools and the kind of shrieking, joyful noise that fills every corridor of a place like that on a weekday. A place that attracts families from across the Midwest, that is designed specifically to feel safe and contained and full of pleasure. A 6-year-old boy with a Spider-Man backpack would have found it extraordinary. The security footage from the Kalahari shows them there together, checking in, present, and accounted for, in the way that people are present in places that have cameras everywhere. On the morning of May 13th, 2011, Amy and Timothy Pitzen checked out of the Kalahari Resort in Wisconsin Dells. The security cameras captured them together in the checkout line. They were seen leaving the resort together. Timothy was carrying his Spider-Man backpack, and that is the last confirmed sighting of Timothy Pitzen anywhere in the world. What happened between the Kalahari checkout and the next documented moment in Amy's movements is a gap of approximately 4 hours that covers somewhere between 40 and 200 miles of rural highway, depending on the route taken. But there is one data point inside that gap. At some point between noon and 1:30 in the afternoon on May 13th after the Kalahari checkout, before Amy appeared alone in Winnebago, Amy made phone calls to family members. She called her mother and her brother-in-law. She told them that she and Timothy were fine, that they were safe, that no one needed to worry. During the call with her brother-in-law, Timothy could be heard in the background. He said he was hungry. That is the last confirmed time anyone outside of Amy heard Timothy Pitzen's voice. The next confirmed sighting of Amy alone was at 7:25 in the evening at a Family Dollar store in Winnebago, Illinois, a town about 40 miles south of Wisconsin Dells. She was buying a pen, notepaper, and envelopes. She was unaccompanied. She was next spotted at 8 o'clock that evening at a Sullivan's Foods grocery store in Winnebago, again alone. At approximately 11:15 that night, she checked into the Rockford Inn in Rockford, Illinois. At 12:30 in the afternoon on May 14th, a hotel maid found Amy Pitzen in her room. She was dead. She had taken her own life. On the nightstand, she had left a note. Here's the critical detail. The note did not explain what had happened to Timothy. It apologized for the mess she had made, and it said, explicitly, that Timothy was safe, that he was with people who would take good care of him, and that he would never be found. He would never be found. Not that something had happened to him. Not that he was gone in the way Georgia Jean Weckler or Evelyn Hartley were gone. That he was safe and cared for, and that the people who had him would protect him, and that no one would ever know where he was. Now this is where the impossible gap in this case opens. The 4 hours between the Kalahari checkout and Amy's appearance in Winnebago cover somewhere between 40 and 200 miles of rural Illinois highways, depending on the route. In those 4 hours, something happened to Timothy. Either Amy handed him to someone, a person, or persons who agreed to take him, to keep him, to raise him without anyone knowing, or something else happened that the evidence has never been able to confirm. Investigators examined Amy's car carefully. They found blood. A family member later said that the staining was consistent with a nosebleed Timothy had experienced in the car earlier in the month. That explanation could not be confirmed or ruled out. Amy's cell phone was missing from the room when she was found. In 2013, it was located near Route 78, a rural Illinois highway. The phone's discovery did not produce actionable new information. But here's what doesn't make sense, and has never made sense. The note says he's safe. The note says he's with people who will care for him. A woman who is going to take her own life does not typically construct a fiction in the final hours to protect the feelings of people she will never speak to again. The language suggests to Amy's father, to investigators, to the people who have spent years trying to understand this, that Amy actually placed Timothy with someone. That the plan, if there was a plan, involved ensuring his care. James Pitzen, Timothy's father, has stated consistently that he believes his son is alive. That Amy gave him to someone who has kept him hidden. That somewhere, Timothy Pitzen is a person in his early 20s who may or may not know his own name. In April of 2019, 8 years after Timothy disappeared, a young man walked up to police in Newport, Kentucky, and said he was Timothy Pitzen. He said he had just escaped from captors who had held him for years. The story was specific and alarming, and national news immediately. The Pitzen family, for a few hours, allowed themselves to feel something close to hope. Then the FBI ran DNA. The young man was Brian Michael Reaney, 23 years old, from Medina, Ohio. He had been released from prison less than a month earlier. He had seen a television special about the Pitzen case and had fabricated the entire story. He pleaded guilty to federal charges of making false statements to law enforcement. He was sentenced to 2 years in federal prison. The Pitzen family, who had felt their son come back to them for a few hours, experienced losing him again. The National Center for Missing and Exploited Children has released age progression photographs of Timothy at intervals over the years, what he might look like at age 13, at 16, and most recently as a young man in his early 20s. Aurora police have worked with national organizations to keep the case visible. The Aurora Police Department maintains a dedicated tip line for the Pitzen case that has been active since 2011. James Pitzen has never stopped looking. He has given interviews over the years in which he describes the same core belief that Timothy is alive, that he is somewhere, that the person who took him or received him is still out there, and that someday the right person will say the right thing to the right investigator, and the gap in the record will finally close. He has said that Timothy might be sitting next to someone right now without that person knowing who he is. He has asked people to look. He has never stopped asking. Timothy Pitzen would be 20 years old today. In the security footage from the Kalahari Resort in Wisconsin Dells on the morning of May 13, 2011, he is a 6-year-old boy at a checkout counter with a Spider-Man backpack. The security camera catches him clearly. He is present and visible and completely unaware of what is about to happen to him. And then the cameras stop finding him. And 15 years of investigation, 2 major federal searches, and 1 devastating hoax have not been able to locate him again. 4 hours, a few hundred miles of rural highway between Wisconsin and Illinois, a note on a nightstand in Rockford that said he was safe and would never be found, and a Spider-Man backpack somewhere in the world, belonging to a young man who, if Amy's note told the truth about one thing is alive and has no idea that his father and his family and the Aurora Police Department and the FBI are still looking for him every single day. Pull the map back up. Start at the southeastern corner of the state and trace it north and west. A half-mile driveway off Highway 12 in Jefferson County, where a little girl with a handful of mail turned and walked toward a farmhouse on a rainy Thursday afternoon in 1947 and simply didn't arrive. A residential block on Hochler Drive in La Crosse, where a radio played to an empty room on homecoming night in 1953, and a pair of broken eyeglasses sat on a floor until the police bagged them. A parking lot at a highway interchange in Concord, an Interstate 94 exit in the dark fields of Jefferson County, where a blue dress and a corsage stepped through a door in the small hours of June 1974 and did not come back through it. A bicycle path near Shattuck Middle School in Neenah, where a 67-year-old man went for a ride in the summer of 1983 and wound up, 38 years later, in a state park that people had been walking through for decades without knowing he was there. Continue north. A parking lot on West Wilson Avenue in Menasha, where 3 people inside an apartment heard a car door close and waited for a knock that never came, and where a styrofoam cup sat on the hood of a locked Volkswagen until someone finally moved it. A family property on Lunt Road in Helenville, where 4 living beings, a mother, a father, a son, and a cocker spaniel named Hunter, loaded up for a holiday weekend in the summer of 1998 and never reached the cabin in Coloma. A lot near Lambeau Field in Green Bay, where a locked car held a phone and a purse and a set of keys belonging to a pregnant 19-year-old on a full scholarship, and where 900 miles on the odometer went to a destination nobody has ever mapped. A house on Lacey Road in Fitchburg, where a record kept spinning after the person who put it on was gone, and where a dog turned up at a neighbor's house, missing his collar and looking confused. A McDonald's on the main strip of Antigo in north-central Wisconsin, where a 15-year-old gymnast said goodbye to a friend working a shift and got back into a car, and where a condemned house in Wausau became the last address anyone can point to with any certainty, and the checkout counter of the Kalahari Resort in Wisconsin Dells, where a 6-year-old boy with a Spider-Man backpack was captured on security camera for the last time on the morning of May 13, 2011, and then was simply gone, absorbed into 4 hours of rural Illinois highway that no investigator has been able to account for. 10 pins on the map, 10 people, 10 Wisconsin places. Here's what they share. These cases that span 7 decades, and every kind of Wisconsin geography, the farmland and the lake, cities and the college towns, and the water park, and the highway interchange, and the apartment parking lots of the Fox Valley. Every single one of them has a thing left behind. Georgia Jean's footsteps that ended on a farm lane with nobody to say what came next. Evelyn's shoes on a highway shoulder miles from the house she was supposed to be safe in. Kathy's corsage somewhere in the dark outside a building full of teenagers, none of whom heard her leave. Starkie in a public park that thousands of people walked through for 38 years without knowing he was there. Laurie's cup on a locked hood in a parking lot where 3 people were listening 10 feet away. The Krnak's truck, wiped of fingerprints, parked an hour from home with 2,600 miles on it that go to North Carolina and back and tell you exactly what you need to know and nothing that you can take to a jury. Amber's phone in a locked car in the shadow of a stadium with 900 miles that nobody can trace. Amos's record in the run-out groove, still spinning. Kayla's question mark at a condemned address in Wausau on a dark Tuesday night in August. Timothy's note on a nightstand that said he was safe and would never be found, a promise that was the cruelest possible combination of hope and impossibility. The things left behind are the part of these cases that resist resolution. They're more specific than a name, more personal than a date. The cup balanced on the hood, the record still turning, the broken glasses on a floor. Each of those objects sat there patient, inanimate, utterly indifferent to what had just happened in the space around them, and became the only physical evidence that a person had existed in that place and then stopped. They're what these families go back to, in the middle of the night, because they're the most concrete thing available. Everything else is theory, possibility, rumor, lead. The cup on the hood is a fact. What we know about these 10 cases, when we lay the facts out plainly, Most of them are officially still open and will be until someone makes a different choice. Georgia Jean Weckler's file, the second oldest in Wisconsin's missing persons system, has never been closed, and the detective currently assigned to it has said she does not expect to close it without new evidence that nobody has yet come forward with. Evelyn Hartley's case has been open for more than 70 years, the longest running of these 10. Catherine Sjoberg, 50 years of silence at a highway interchange in Jefferson County. Laurie Depies, 33 years, no remains, no arrests, a confession from a serial killer that investigators searched and couldn't substantiate. Amber Wilde, 27 years, an active homicide designation, FBI involvement, persons of interest who have never faced charges. Amos Mortier, 20 years, a homicide determination made by his own police department, people who chose federal prison over cooperation, a $25,000 reward that has never been claimed. Kayla Berg, 16 years, an FBI reward unclaimed, a 2023 search in Kewaunee County that came up empty. Timmothy Pitzen, 15 years, age progressions issued into early adulthood, a father who has never stopped asking people to look. 2 of the 10 have moved toward resolution. Starkie Swenson's remains were identified in a state park in 2021, 38 years after he disappeared. 27 years after a man was convicted of his murder without a body. His family finally had a place to point to on the map. The Krnak case produced a conviction for Allen's murder in 2006, and Derek Anderson is serving life without parole. But Donna Krnak and Thomas Krnak remain on the missing persons list. A wedding ring in a North Carolina forest and 1,000 miles of unexplained truck mileage are the closest thing to a location anyone has. The others are open. The files are still being carried by detectives in Green Bay and Antigo, and Fitchburg and La Crosse, and Jefferson County and Fox Crossing, and the Aurora Police Department in Illinois. Every year that passes makes the chemistry of those cases harder. Witnesses age, memories drift, physical evidence degrades. The people who know things get older and sometimes die still knowing them. The window that was 6 days wide when Kayla Berg went missing and nobody filed a report. The window that was a week wide when Amos's friends finally called the police. Those windows closed long ago. What remains is the grinding, patient, undramatic work of investigators revisiting old leads, following new tips from inmates and podcasts and anniversary news cycles, waiting for the person who has been almost ready to say something for years to finally say it. Here's what the families of these 10 people have in common. They have been living with an absence so specific and personal that it has a shape, not the diffuse grief that comes with death, with its rituals and markers, and its accepted cultural narrative about what endings look like, but the particular kind of endurance required when there is no ending. When the file is open, when the answer still exists somewhere and belongs to someone who has chosen not to give it. Eleanor Weckler leaving a light on for 50 years in case Georgia Jean came home, and dying at 93 in a world that still had no answer for her. James Pitzen saying on camera that Timothy might be sitting next to someone right now, completely unaware. Hope Berg standing in front of news cameras on the anniversary of August 11th, year after year, still doing the thing where you hold your grief out toward the public and ask if anyone recognizes it. Margie Milutinovich on the shoulder of Lacey Road in the Wisconsin November, holding a sign with her son's face up to the cars. Ruth Schwartz holding a memorial service in 1995 with nothing to bury. Laurie Depies coming back to the microphone every September 23rd because coming back is the only option that exists. These are not abstract victims in a database. They are people who were known, who were specific, who had squid tattoos and Spider-Man backpacks and vinyl records and choreography dreams and full scholarships and May baskets they wanted to pick. The absence of each of them has a particular shape, and the people who loved them have been navigating around that shape for years, for decades, for lifetimes. Pull the map back. Wisconsin looks like the kind of place nothing bad happens. Small towns with frozen lakes and grain elevators, county highways through dairy country, a water park resort where families line up for the wave pool on a May morning, a half-mile driveway where a family has lived for generations. 10 people, 10 ordinary places, a door that didn't open, a car that didn't come home, a light in a farmhouse window that nobody turned on anymore after 1996. The files are open. If you know something about any of these cases, about any of the names on this map, the contact information for each investigating agency is in the description below. The reward lines are still active. The families are still listening. And whoever is carrying these answers, in some combination of Wisconsin towns and Wisconsin counties, and the spaces between, they've been carrying them for a long time. 10 cases. The map is still incomplete. Most of the doors on this list are still open, not metaphorically, but literally, in the administrative sense. Active investigations, open files, detectives assigned, tip lines staffed, families still in contact with law enforcement. Every time an anniversary comes around, the files are being carried. The questions are not resolved. And whoever is holding the answers in some combination of Wisconsin counties and small towns, and the spaces between, has been carrying them for a long time. Some of them have been carrying them for 70 years. If you have information about any of the cases covered in this episode, about Georgia Jean Weckler, Evelyn Hartley, Catherine Sjoberg, Laurie Depies, the Krnak family, Amber Wilde, Amos Mortier, Kayla Berg, or Timmothy Pitzen, the contact information for each investigating agency is in the description below. The reward lines are still active. The families are still listening. The door is still open.